Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's virtual listening session with the DNC's Rules and Bylaws Committee, which is being streamed live on the DNC's YouTube channel. I'm Mignon Moore, and I co-chair the Rules and Bylaws Committee, or RBC as it's commonly known, which serves as the committee within the DNC responsible for designing the 2024 presidential nominating process and calendar. I am joined today by my fellow co-chair, Jim Roosevelt from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I believe he's in DC today celebrating a very special occasion. I'll let him tell you about that. But before we get started with today's program, Jim and I would like to take a moment to acknowledge yesterday's shooting in Texas, Uvalde, I believe it's spelled, I believe it's pronounced. And it came so quickly on the heels of what just happened in Buffalo. These events are tragedies and they occur way, way, way too often. Our prayers go out to the families and our hearts go out to the legislators who must do something immediately to stop this. In his statement, in the chair's statement yesterday, he said, we need more than just thoughts and prayers. We need to take action. I think we can all agree on that. Please join me for a moment of silence for the innocent lives that have been lost due to gun violence in this country. Thank you. As we move through today's session, Jim and I will both be serving as your MCs. I will hand it over to Jim now to give an overview of the presidential nominating process and our program tonight. Jim?
Hello, everybody. I am going to join you by video in just a second. Give me a minute to get this set here. So as Mignon suggested, I am in Washington, D.C., and a little bit between things because we are here because our newest grandchild just came home from the hospital last night. And I'm standing outside his house right now. That's our good news. His name is Devin, and he is great. And you may hear his 2-year-old brother, Liam, in the background, too. But let's go on with our business. And it's great to have all of you here today. And thank you, Mignon, for kicking things off. As you indicated, the Rules and Bylaws Committee is drafting the 2024 delegate selection rules and the call to the convention. This committee has been meeting monthly to develop the 2024 delegate selection rules and a nominating process that reflects the diversity of our party, gives candidates the opportunity to meet the voters of all types, and ultimately produce the strongest possible Democratic nominee for president. After the delegate selection rules and call are approved by the DNC this fall, each state party will prepare its plan for selecting delegates to the national convention. The RBC, as we call the Rules and Bylaws Committee, will review each state's plan for compliance with the rules, including the rule that sets the timing of presidential primaries and caucuses. Since 1980, the DNC's delegate selection rules have permitted each state party to determine when to hold its primary or caucus, as long as the date of those contests falls within a predetermined window. Traditionally, the RBC has exempted Iowa and New Hampshire, and beginning in 2008, Nevada and South Carolina, causing a pre-window set of nominating contests. The members of this committee are committed to taking a critical look at all aspects of the nominating process, including how the pre-window states are selected and exempted. We do that every 4 years. And to that end, the committee recently approved a resolution that allows the RBC to select up to 5 states to hold early contests based on a set of criteria that includes diversity, competitiveness in the general election, and the ability to administer a transparent and verifiable process. In striving to create a truly inclusive process, The RBC also agreed to hold 4 virtual public hearings in which party stakeholders are given the opportunity to voice their views on the pre-window schedule. This is one of those. The purpose of these listening sessions is to create an official record of input on the pre-window schedule from Democratic Party stakeholders who do not have an official platform to provide their comments, such as at an RBC meeting. These sessions will allow our constituencies an opportunity to provide the RBC and its members with insights on how to ensure a diverse, inclusive, and transparent process. And while our speaking time is limited during each session, the DNC has added a portal to its website for all interested parties to submit testimony for the RBC's review. You will receive a link to that portal in an email following this session. Stakeholders like you, representatives from constituencies like SEIU, UFCW, advocacy groups, and others will be able to use this form. You may access it at www.democrats.org/2024-delegate-selection-process. And I believe somebody will put that address in the chat as well. Before we begin, would you like to add anything, Mignon?
Thank you, Jim. I would like to acknowledge the team helping facilitate this session. We have the staff of the Office of Party Affairs and Delegate Selection, Office Assistant Jenna Whitaker, PATS Advisor Rick Boylan, and Director Veronica Martinez-Roman. We also greatly appreciate all of the help of the DNC, in particular our counsel Graham Wilson and Adrian Levine. This program is also supported by the Association of State Democratic Committees, DNC coalitions, research, mobilization, and the political departments and the Secretary's office. So we have the full weight of the DNC behind these meetings. Thank you, everyone. If you have any questions about the work of the DNC Rules and Bylaws Committee, please do not hesitate to contact our team. Now let's begin our listening session. Jim and I will call on speakers who will offer remarks and then answer any questions the RBC members may have for them. Once there are no more questions, we'll move on to the next speaker. Jim, I will turn this back over to you.
Thank you, Mignon. I appreciate that. And I have a little 2-year-old assistant here. You may hear in the background. And just a minute here. So our next speaker, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, is Dr. Julia Azari. Dr. Azari is Associate Professor and Assistant Chair in the Department of Political Science at Marquette University. Her research and teaching interests include the American presidency, American political parties, and the politics of the American state. Dr. Azari, we look forward to your remarks.
Hello, thank you so much for inviting me. And it's great to see my former student, Jason Ray, here from many years ago. So as the introduction noted, I write about political parties, presidential history, and interpreting elections. And in the past 5 years or so, I've been especially interested in party legitimacy and the perception of political parties. And so I wanted to share some of the things that I've been thinking about and the findings of my research and link them to some of the stated objectives of this process, including competitiveness and diversity. I see 3 main challenges facing political parties in general, and I'll speak about how I think those are presenting challenges for the Democratic Party specifically. The first of these is the perception of party politics and legitimacy. I've been working on a study with a graduate student of mine, Jennifer Wendling, on the kind of public's trust and confidence in political parties. And my reading of public opinion polls over time suggest that Americans distrust political parties as institutions, even as they appreciate them as choices. That choice is really important to how Americans think about party politics. One thing that I've observed in doing quantitative work on these surveys is that as the Democratic primary nomination contests have become more competitive in the 21st century, that the relationship between overall levels of institutional trust and evaluations of the Democratic Party that relationship has become stronger. And I think that that is something for party leaders and elites to think about. We also evaluated about 5,000 responses that people wrote in surveys about why they have the level of confidence they do in various political institutions. Out of these responses, for political parties, references to elite domination and corruption and representation issues, not feeling represented, were particularly prominent. This was fairly even across evaluations of members of both parties. I did not find a lot of partisan differences there, but the political parties essentially are seen by many Americans as being unrepresentative, dominated by elites, and not open to ordinary Americans' perspectives. I think this perception of political parties is a huge problem for American democracy. I think it's a competitiveness issue for the Democratic Party, and I think it's much larger than some of the issues that I hear in these discussions, which is about how to design the nomination to nominate a particular kind of candidate. I think that these broader perception issues were a problem in 2016. I think they could have become a problem in 2020. And I think that is a key priority in a way that the party can use this early nomination contest to balance the imperative of winnowing down and selecting a nominee, but also truly creating a sense among the party's voters that they really do have input and that there really is meaningful competition within political parties for presidential nominations. The second problem I see, which is, again, maybe an especially pronounced problem for the Democratic Party, is bringing together disparate elements of the party. We have urban and rural divisions. We have an especially pronounced young and old division, to put it a little crudely, in the Democratic Party. And racial differences across different racial groups that identify within the party. The Midwest is especially, I think, an important place to address some of these issues. You have areas that not only include a mixture of urban rural voters, but that their kind of political context, Wisconsin in particular, where I live, that have already experienced a lot of urban rural tensions. These are places where I think those issues and ideas are quite salient on voters' minds and provide good kind of training ground to think about bringing the party together across those lines. Again, not to pick out specific states, but just to sort of give an overview. Both Wisconsin and Minnesota have become, Minnesota has become more urban, and both states have become more racially diverse over time, over the 21st century. Finally, I think that the structure of Midwestern voting in some states offers an opportunity. Same-day registration and open primaries offer an opportunity to engage young people and socialize people into voting, and socialize them, if that's your objective, into partisanship. And finally, on this note, I would encourage the parties to think about the end of the process as well as the beginning. I'm glad, given my research, given my concern about perceptions of legitimacy and competitiveness in parties, that the parties are thinking about bringing more states into the early part of the process. But the more I've thought about the 2020 nomination, the more it occurs to me that there was something missing at the end. And that end process and developing a narrative about why a particular candidate won, and what that says about the party and how that will incorporate disparate elements of the party, I think is really critical. The third piece is media narratives. And I know that political parties have limited control over what members of the media decide to do. And I've written empirical analyses of how the news media writes about the primary process in political parties. And I have some kind of general observations about what that looks like and how parties might think about essentially generating different sound bites and guiding toward different language. News media really emphasizes electability and the question of who's an outsider and who's an insider. And these pieces of coverage, I think, really detract from actual issues that voters care about. I think that organizing a primary process, developing an early process, developing this early stage and engaging different kinds of geographical regions, I think in some ways can allow for candidates with lower name recognition to compete and has a potential to move away from this insider-outsider dichotomy that I don't think serves anyone. I don't think it serves party competitiveness. I don't think it serves voters. And so focusing on a process that can allow for lots of different candidates to compete and move away from generating this insider-outsider narrative, not giving those sound bites to the media if at all possible, can really help focus on experience, policy, and the issues that affect voters. So those are kind of the three main priorities that I've been thinking about and the areas of challenge that I see as really facing political parties in the 21st century. And I'll be happy to take any questions that you might have. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Azari. Very fascinating insights. Do any of the members of the RBC have questions at this time? If you have a question, please be sure to use the raise hand function. And Jenna, would you let me know if we have any members with questions?
Mr. Chair, I am not seeing any questions at this time.
Okay.
Sorry, apologies. I see that Secretary Ray has raised his hand.
All right, Jason, would you go ahead, please?
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Dr. Azari, first, thanks for joining us. Good to see you, as always. I was curious when you talked about kind of the end of the process a little bit and how to keep that narrative going. And I think one of the things we've seen in our contest is a lot of front loading by states to go right in that Super Tuesday window and kind of wrap up. Do you have thoughts on what that calendar could look like or how we keep that momentum going if states continue to feel that need to go early?
Of course I'm on mute. It's not one of these things unless someone's on mute. I think this is really tricky because I realize that there's an imperative for parties to try and winnow down to a nominee very quickly. But I think that it's not, my focus is maybe not so much on keeping things competitive up until the very end. I think that can be advantageous if that's sort of what's happening organically. But what I think is actually more important is for parties, and I know this is not really super concrete in how you're going to design the primaries, but to think about what the end of that process looks like. When someone crosses the delegate threshold, how does the party kind of message about what's happening? And in that period between the delegate threshold or between the end of the primaries and the convention, developing, and this is obviously my kind of area that I'm hung up on is the interpretation of elections, is how is there a story about who won and why? And that story can, I think, incorporate the dynamics of early contests as well as a sort of Super Tuesday type contests is, what is the story? Why did this person win? And, specifically just to completely tip my hand, I've been thinking about this in the context of the weird way that 2020 ended and the fact that there was so much emphasis on Biden's electability. And then there was such a weird period in June 20 or, leading up to summer 2020 that didn't really allow for a narrative about how Biden represented different parts of the party other than he was electable and everyone was kind of on something else at that point. So I think that this is might be a little bit outside of the direct scope of the contest, but I think has to do with how the meaning is sort of construed out of those contests.
Thank you. Our next question is from Frank Leone.
Hi. Hello. Thank you, Dr. Sorry. You started out by talking about confidence and trust in political parties. And I think most of your comments were geared towards the Democratic Party, which we appreciate because that's why we're here. But have you found differences in perceptions of the political parties? Do people share the views of the Republican Party in terms of lack of trust and confidence broadly, or is that just that, or does each party still stay in its own lane?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would have probably presented better material if I'm not at home and I don't have access to my statistical software. But what I have from this paper that the grad student and I worked on, we use two data sources. We use the American National Election Studies, and that we look at controlling for partisanship and a variety of other factors, how people sort of the feeling thermometer, 0 to 100, how warmly they feel toward political parties. And actually the factors we found that affected the perceptions of the two parties were fairly similar. Looking just at these quantitative scores, but I will say institutional trust was, if I remember right, is more pronounced, larger correlation regression coefficient for Democrats than Republicans. And my hunch is that does have to do with perceptions of the nomination process, and maybe specifically narratives that emerged about the delegates in the superdelegates in 2016. So yeah, I'm looking at my regression right now, and yeah, that trust in government is the coefficient is about twice the size for Democrats as for Republicans. Although in 2016, the shape of the thing looks pretty similar. The other source that we use is a survey on broad confidence in institutions, and so it just asks people about political parties. It doesn't ask about the two parties specifically, but that too, I was actually very surprised at how few partisan differences there were in terms of how Democrats and Republicans answered that survey and the types of reasons that they gave. There weren't a lot of pronounced party differences. So it's actually been an interesting story of party symmetry in a world that otherwise is quite asymmetric.
Thanks very much. Our next question is from Joanne Dowdell.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Azari, for your presentation. I actually have two questions. In the beginning, you spoke about meaningful competition, and I was wondering if you were speaking of meaningful competition between the states and their primary campaigns or process, or meaningful competition between the candidates. That's question one. And then second, your research you've stated is around parties, but did it include candidates? So trust in parties, did it translate to trust in candidates or lack thereof? Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Those are great questions. Am I still on? No, okay. Sorry. Let's see. So the first one, thank you for that, the clarification. What I mean is competition among candidates. And I think that there's the research that I've shown, and also my own experience, honestly, as someone who aged into the electorate around the beginning of the 21st century, is initially one in which parties are really looking to wrap up their nominations as quickly as possible. And then which Iowa was deciding for the whole country, which I know is something that someone brought up in the Southern listening session, which I listened to somewhat today. And I know we're not supposed to talk about specific states, sorry. But, I think it's that sense. And then through 2016, and there's some good research on this. Maybe you're going to hear from Caitlin Jewett at some point in West Virginia, but if not, she's definitely someone to look at who's done some work on people's perceptions of the process. And she did some work on that in 2016. And, it was generally that people didn't trust the nomination process. I don't remember how much she engages those the dynamics between the two parties. To your second question about candidates, I would love to run that study. To my knowledge, no one has. That would be a great study to run, but I don't have data on that, so I can't speak to that. I suspect that connection is probably there, but I just don't have the data.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Azari. And our next question is from Dr. Elaine Kmark.
All right.
Hi, Julia. How are you?
Hello. Good. Sorry, I missed our meeting yesterday.
Here, yeah. You didn't meet the earlier meeting, which was sort of on the same topic. You said two things from your research that are really interesting. You said one is that there's particularly big differences within the Democrats between old and young, and I feel that I think we all see that a lot. And you also then talked about different sound bites that parties could use. And my question is the leadership of our party, the congressional leadership, the president, is how big of a factor is simply their age in this difference between old and young? Is there a way to deal with that? What do you have any insight to share on that?
Yeah, I wish I had more about how to address this specifically. It seems to me like this is a pretty persistent problem that maps on sort of to ideology, but what I see more deeply as a question about preserving the status quo versus engaging in really deep change. And it seems like that maps onto the priorities of young and old voters. Again, I don't have all my stuff with me, so I don't have all my data. And I know there were some pretty big age gaps in the last two primaries that kind of map onto that. Establishment candidates were more popular with older Democrats, and the ones perceived as less establishment were more popular with younger Democrats. And it does seem like this might be sort of similar to the electability question in that these are kind of there are words you could use to move people away from thinking about these divisions that can't really be resolved, right? And that instead of messaging around norms and the status quo, those are important. They're important to a lot of people, but also thinking about how that orientation and a more change orientation can be integrated. And I think this is really deeply connected to the primaries. And I want to reiterate my point about looking at which states have kind of young people friendly rules, like same day registration. I haven't seen that come up a lot in these discussions, but I think that actually really helps bring young people into the process and feel like they're not paying attention to the election as some group of elites has already picked the candidates.
Hey, thank you very much, Dr. Azari. You've given us a lot to think about, and we may trouble you for some more input at some point. Thank you very, very much.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm now going to turn it back to Mignon for our next couple of speakers.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Azaria. That was really, really, really fascinating. And I tell you, you left us with some really big thoughts here from all the questioners. So thank you so much for your presentation. Our next speaker, who happens to be a person that I am particularly fond of, Marlon Marshall. Marlon is a senior advisor and a founding partner at 270 Strategy. He served as the special assistant to the president and deputy director in President Obama's Office of Public Engagement, where I just left. He has led all the on-the-ground enrollment for the Affordable Care Act, which is important, as we know. He was also instrumental in helping the administration launch My Brother's Keepers Community Challenge, a program that worked with cities and focused on making sure young people of color and all youth have a chance to succeed. Thank you for taking the time to be with us, Marlon. I think the last time I was with you, we were on a Zoom together. So it's great to see you again. It's been a little over a year. I think you're on mute.
There we go. Can everybody hear me okay? Awesome. Good to see you too, Mignon. And very rare that you get to get introduced from one of your mentors. So it's good to see you. And I just appreciate you. Just want to like to say it in front of everyone. Good to see many familiar faces on this call as well, too. Got to give a shout out to Ken Martin as well, who's also a Jayhawk. We won the national championship in men's college basketball this year, so I had to just say that because it's the Midwest. And then for those of you who haven't met Marlon Marshall, as Mignon said, I've worked in the White House and worked on campaigns for a number of years. I reside in Denver, Colorado right now with my wife and twin daughters who are almost 5. But I'm born and raised in the Midwest, which is why I wanted to join you today. I think I will probably not be as amazing as the speaker beforehand. She was like scientific and all those good things. And you won't get that from me. But I wanted to talk about the Midwest from a party building perspective, because I just think that's important as you guys are considering how to look at the calendar from this upcoming year. I'm born and raised St. Louis, Missouri. I went to University of Kansas, as I mentioned before. And then one of my first presidential campaign, or I volunteered on, was Gore 2000. And I was volunteering in Kansas City, Missouri. And I remember that race being very close. I remember staying up all night like many of us did. And remember, obviously, the outcome, but also what happened in Missouri, which was Gore losing by about 2 to 3 percentage points at the time. In 2004, I worked in Missouri on the Kansas City side as an organizer. And I was really excited about what we could do in our home state. I thought we could bring it back to where it was in 92 and 96 under President Bill Clinton. And ultimately, I remember getting a call in October saying that it looked like Missouri was likely we weren't going to win. I ended up moving to Cuyahoga County at the very end of the election. And then obviously we all know the outcome of 2004. 2008, I worked for Hillary in the primary. And after the primary was over, I went to run the coordinator in Missouri in 2008. There's a pattern here in my home state. And when Obama was winning everything, Indiana, which still to this day shocks me, and we lost Missouri by roughly 3,000 votes. And I knew at that time, I was like, something's happening in this state. We got really, really close. But even in a good year, something's happening in the state, something's happening in this region of the country. I couldn't put my finger on it. Fast forward to 2012, I worked on Obama's reelection campaign in Chicago, and we didn't really play in Missouri, and we weren't successful. And then in 2016, we didn't play in Missouri as well, too. But what was happening in Missouri started happening in other places in the Midwest. We saw what happened in obviously Wisconsin and Michigan, and Minnesota being closer than we all thought. Things in the Midwest were starting to erode a little bit. And I know that talking to many of you on this phone, the importance of building the party and building it at the grassroots level. And I think when you have states early on that allows for candidates to campaign in those states, it adds to the energy you need that allows you to build the party at the grassroots level. It's going to allow the state party, it's going to allow the county parties to do what they need to do to continue to get volunteers up. And even though we still have great candidates in many of these areas, at the state reps, state house folks, state senate folks, United States congressmen and women, Senate candidates, we had Claire in Missouri for a while, and then ultimately biting her as well too. Nothing's like when you have presidential candidates and campaigns coming into these states, showing people, talking about what matters to folks, talking about their daily lives, talking about their economics, talking about equity. When they hear that from a candidate directly and coming into these states, it really just allows you to build a party. And I think as we're thinking about how do we get to 270, which should be our ultimate goal, how do we get to 270 electoral votes, having many of these states on the front end, I think will just help us as we move forward and get to 270 electoral votes. I'm not here advocating for Missouri. I use Missouri as an example because that's my home state, but I am advocating as we think about the calendar. How do we make sure the Midwest is represented? And other states as well too. We need to be thinking about a diversity. I think we need to make sure that all voices are heard, particularly folks that look like me, who have been the backbone of the party for many, many years. But as we think geographically, I think we got to take a strong look at what's happened in the Midwest the last 10, 20 years. How do we continue to build a party local level? And ultimately, that's how we set ourselves up, in my opinion, for success a decade from now, is that we start now, we start at the grassroots level, then we start electing more state reps, more state senators, more folks on county councils, and all those folks will be your next United States Congress folks. And then ultimately, we'll find the next president of the United States from that batch. So that's just what I wanted to say. I want to advocate for that from a Midwest perspective. Again, being from there, I feel very strongly and passionately about how we are doing in the Midwest. How do we make sure our voices are heard? And just wanted to note that as you guys are considering the changes to the rules and calendar of coming up. So I'll stop, take questions. Again, didn't have anything scientific, but did say from my perspective of doing this work for a while and seeing what's happening on campaigns, I think one of the best ways to build the party back up is to make sure that we are there and we show the people that we are there all day, every day.
Well, Marlon, as a Midwesterner myself, I certainly appreciate you bringing voice to the Midwest, because often we think about, some of these states and they're either in the lost column before we even get to them. So thank you for speaking up on behalf of the Midwest. I have no views as co-chair, but it was great to have somebody advocating. Do we have any questions for Marlon? Jenna, do you see any?
I do not see any questions right now.
That means you knocked it out the park, Marlon. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Well, good to see you. Good to see everybody, and hope to see everybody soon. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So our next speaker tonight is Ohio Education President Scott DeMauro. President DeMauro was elected in 2019 after having served as vice president of the organization for 6 years. Over his 30-year career as an educator, Scott has worked to provide students the critical thinking and decision-making skills that they need to be successful citizens in our democratic society. He has likewise advocated for students, educators, and strong public schools at all levels of his union. Thank you for taking the time, Scott, to be with us today. Please take it away.
All right, well, thank you. And I really appreciate this opportunity to speak with all of you this evening. As was stated in the introduction, I am a high school social studies teacher, proud to be serving as president of the largest labor union in the state of Ohio, affiliated with the National Education Association, which is the largest labor union in our nation. We represent educators and education support professionals in every corner, every county of our state. I also serve currently as a member of the DNC Finance Committee and am a member of the Executive Committee of the Ohio Democratic Party. So throughout my 30 plus years as an educator, I have witnessed unprecedented attacks by the right on education, on unions, and most notably on our democracy. And that is so clear over the last couple of years. More than a decade ago, politicians in Ohio pushed to eliminate workers' rights to collectively bargain in a brazen attempt to eliminate educators' voices at the bargaining table. And we were proud to be part of a united coalition in this state in 2011 to stand up, to say no, to reject overwhelmingly that effort to repeal Senate Bill 5 in Ohio, that effort to limit educators' voices. And so I'm coming to you today, as someone who believes very strongly in the power of educators' voices and very supportive of the direction that the party is going in terms of making sure that all voices are included and we're much more representative in terms of the selection process for the leader of our party. Last month, I'll also add, again, some additional context of what's going on here in Ohio. Right-wing extremists in the legislature introduced new legislation that takes the worst of Florida's Don't Say Gay bill, combines it with the worst of the education censorship legislation that prevents teaching of an honest history about race and racism in our country, and is pushing that in a very cynical attempt to try to drive wedges of distrust and turn out voters who are buying into this culture war that they are promoting. And then, of course, Ohio is not immune to what we've seen in other states with efforts to roll back voting rights. Fortunately, we've been successful in stopping any rollback of democracy in terms of election law in this state. But there are multiple bills that are pending, and we have been very vigilant with our democracy partners in protecting early voting, protecting mail-in voting, protecting against eliminating or requiring photo IDs as the only form of identification for voters. So all of these things, make it abundantly clear that elected officials, Republican elected officials in Ohio and across the country, are pushing policies to ostracize our communities, whether in the workplace or in the classroom, and they know that access to the polls remains voters' last line of defense. These attacks on our democracy are dangerous, and we cannot let this anti-democratic policy reshape our community or the country that we love. As an educator, I have worked tirelessly throughout my career to help my students develop the critical thinking, problem-solving, and decision-making skills that are so essential to be effective citizens in our democracy. That is why I chose to be an educator. Ever since I made that decision, as a college student, standing up for my students, standing up for educators to ensure everyone has a voice in our country remains the core mission of my professional career. It's why I became involved in my union and why I continue to be involved in this party today. Whether it's at the bargaining table, in developing key policies to ensure every child gets the best public education policy regardless of zip code, or making sure that every person in Ohio has the right to vote in our democratic process, it is so important for educators to step up and speak out. It's no secret that a dysfunctional democracy prevents much needed progress in the classroom and beyond. So we have to lead by example and teach our students that every American, particularly Black, Brown, and Indigenous and young voters, should have their voices heard on Election Day. Fully functioning democracy must start within our own Democratic Party, one that encourages voters to have a voice in choosing the presumptive leader of our party. It's obviously challenging to change a process that has been ingrained in our political culture for generations. But this is an opportunity for voters from every corner and community of our party to not only strengthen the moral compass of the Democratic Party, but ensure that whoever the Democratic candidate who comes out of this process will be fully supported in a position to win and lead our nation going into a general election and beyond. The diversity that makes our party and our country so unique cannot continue to be sidelined in choosing our party's leader. I know it's not easy, but I applaud the DNC. I applaud all of you as members of the Rules and Bylaws Committee for the vision to see where our nation is heading, to include more voices in the voting process as a fundamental tenet of the Democratic Party. And so I applaud you, leaders of the party, for embracing this fundamental principle of our country. It is the job of educators to teach our students about civics, American history, and the power of voting. Students' first experience in civic engagement is in the classroom, and as educators, we want that engagement to last a lifetime. We are all committed to creating lifelong learners. We're also committed to creating lifelong citizens and lifelong voters. We understand as educators that this responsibility is not something that we can take on by sitting on the sideline. And so every day, educators like the 120,000 members of the Ohio Education Association that I'm so proud to lead must make our voices heard in this democracy because we understand the challenges facing our students and our communities. Again, I applaud the Rules and Bylaws Committee for considering ways to ensure more voices within our party are heard. This is indeed a critical step for moving forward to ensure that the democratic process thrives in these challenging times. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak to you today.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Chair. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Jenna to see if there's any questions for the president. And thank you so much for all the work you're doing for our nation's students as we mourn the loss of 19 young precious minds. Thank you so much, Scott.
I do not see any questions from RBC members at this time.
Okay, if no other questions or no questions, I'll turn it back to Jim.
No, thank you, Mignon, and thank you, Scott, for a presentation that obviously people took very much to heart. Our next speaker tonight is Kylie Overson. Kylie served as a member of the North Dakota House of Representatives from 2013 to 2016. She was the youngest state party chair in the United States when she was elected chair of the North Dakota Party in 2015. Kylie was recently elected chair of the DNC's Rural Council, and by recently, I mean last Saturday, and is an associate attorney at the Schneider Law Firm in Fargo. Thank you for giving us your time this evening, Kylie.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Roosevelt, and thank you to the committee for hosting this opportunity and for engaging with the public and members of the party and voters in this way. I'm really heartened by this outreach and look forward to seeing how this outreach shapes our processes and procedures moving forward. I'm hopeful that the committee will really absorb and utilize the feedback that you're receiving in these sessions as you craft the rules and procedures, not just for 2024, but beyond. And first and foremost, I want to say that I truly believe that the Midwest is the region that allows for the most opportunity for growth for the Democratic Party. We have significant opportunity to increase voter turnout, to increase votes for our Democratic candidates from the presidential level all the way down to local school boards and city commissions and state legislative races. I think this is unfortunately the region where we've lost the most ground over the past decade, 2 decades. And hopefully this process, and as we move forward, we have an incredible opportunity to shine a light on the heartland, to invest our energy and attention in listening to and uplifting rural voices and strengthening our candidates, again, from the presidential races all the way down to our local races. One of the things that I believe that the Midwest is, and the states in the Midwest are really excellent at, is collaboration. Allowing Midwestern states to, for example, align their dates in some ways and to allow more states to go in earlier processes helps bolster those smaller, often more red states, and gives them a chance to collaborate and partner with some of the states that have more Democratic voters. And in turn, this attracts more presidential candidates to come to those states early on in the process, to actually engage with the voters in those states, and gives the chance for more meaningful resources to be pivoted towards those states. And ultimately, this, again, brings that attention and resources to states like North Dakota or South Dakota or Nebraska, those Midwestern states that often are overlooked in this process and don't get the time and attention that they deserve. North Dakota, of course, is the state that I know best. So just as an example of this, and allowing Midwest states to be early on in the process, North Dakota in 2016 was a later state. I believe we were in June of that year. And Exchange received the incentive of an extra delegate by going later in the process. However, by that time, the field of candidates was really very narrow, and the delegates, the voters, the prospective delegates, held much more animosity towards the process, as they didn't feel as if their voice actually mattered at that point in the process. And so it was a trade-off that state party leaders made at some point. I'm gonna shut my blinds here. Some point early on in the process, and that didn't allow party leaders to change that outcome later on. In 2020, on the flip side, North Dakota was an earlier state, which meant that more candidates were on the ballot still at that time. More candidates were invested in coming to or engaging with North Dakota in some way. And also, ultimately, this leads to, again, more resources for state parties and their candidates. And one thing I want to encourage this committee to think about, and hopefully all of you already recognize this, that as we're thinking about the presidential primary or nominating process, the impact that this has goes well beyond nominating our president. This goes to strengthening our party from the grassroots on up, allowing us to hopefully regain ground in state legislatures, in our congressional seats. And as we see really significant problems with Roe v. Wade potentially being overturned, with gun violence continuing to ravage our communities, we know that legislative seats, both at the state and national level, are incredibly important. And so, again, know that although we're talking about the presidential nominating process, the impact goes well beyond that. And we have to be cognizant, especially in states in the Midwest, where we have lost so much ground. I encourage the RBC to continue supporting opportunities for vote by mail procedures in this process and allowing states, those with party-run processes, to allow for that opportunity, as this, I believe, encourages and promotes a more diverse participant base, especially true for rural and low-income voters and those in tribal communities that are often far away from the voting hubs in their states. As we know, rural voters make up a broad swath of the Midwest, and I can't say enough about the work we have to do as the Democratic Party to meaningfully re-engage and rebuild our trust with rural voters. And the presidential nominating process allows us a chance to recenter this task and goal in our work. In the Midwest in particular, we look to states like Michigan or Wisconsin, for example, that are not anymore solid blue states. We know that they are doing incredible work, but we still have a lot of work to do to solidify the base in those states. And I think that we all know that those states and early engagement there shifts the ultimate outcome of the presidential election. We look at states like Minnesota that has been, I believe, within 3 points over the last 2 cycles. And again, early engagement in these states really matters. And allowing those states, as I said before, to align dates or otherwise partner with their smaller, more red neighbors provides a bonus benefit to those states and hopefully attracting candidates and resources early on in the process. And we think about diversity in the Midwest. I think one of the earlier speakers noted that in some states we are seeing racial diversity continue to grow. We're seeing those numbers increase, but we also have wide geographic diversity. Again, when we think about the opportunity to focus on rural voters, and I can't understate that or overstate that enough here. And there are also a significant number of sovereign tribal nations in the Midwest, South Dakota, Minnesota, Nebraska. All of these states have sovereign tribal nations that are often in more rural communities. So we have a significant and important opportunity to engage with those communities in a meaningful way to make sure that their voices are heard in this process. So with that, again, I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this. I'd be happy to answer questions if there are any, but again, thank you for taking time to listen to voters and party leaders from across the country.
Kylie, thank you for those insights, and congratulations on the reorganization of the Rural Council.
Thank you.
A couple of your members, your Vice Chair, Leon Brathwaite, and Deb Kozakowski, have kept me updated on that. And it's a great advance in making sure that the voice of the Democratic Party is heard in rural areas, and that the rural areas are heard in the Democratic Party.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Congratulations on that. Jenna, do we have any questions?
I do not see any questions at this time.
All right. So thanks very much for those insights, Kylie, and we appreciate your time this evening. I'll turn it back to Mignon.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Kylie, so much. I'm excited to present our next speaker this evening, Chairman Ben Wickler. Chair Wickler was elected chair of the Democratic Party of Wisconsin in June of 2019. Now in his second term, he has led the party through an unbroken string of statewide victories, including Wisconsin's defeat of Trump in 2020, and built the Wisconsin Dems to a new level of success and a recognition of force as progressive change. Chair Wickler, thank you so much for being with us, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Chair Moore and Roosevelt and Secretary Ray, my fellow Wisconsinite. I'm honored to speak to this committee and to this critical process. And I speak today not as the chair of a state that's applying for early state status. We have quite enough political excitement as it is in Wisconsin. But I speak on behalf of the Midwest as a region to have at least one. And I would venture there's a strong argument for 2 of the early states to be Midwestern states. And there are 3 core reasons for that. The first, echoing the comments by my preceding speaker, who's a fellow, now former state party chair, 2-time, her note that Midwestern states represent the diversity across many dimensions of the Democratic Party across race and ethnicity, across urban, suburban, and rural, that the goal of ensuring that the early states represent the full coalition of the Democratic Party is well served by having a Midwestern state or more Midwestern states in the early nominating process. The second is that the nomination process creates an opportunity to invest in state party infrastructure in states where the party's strength has been a tremendous source of Democratic success. But the third thing that I really want to dwell on is that the Midwestern states represent both the blue wall to prevent Republicans from gaining the presidency and also over and over the tipping point state in the presidential contest. It's almost impossible to win the presidency for a Democrat without prevailing in some of the critical purple Midwestern states. And so having those states and having an electorate that time and again has seen what it takes to win a national presidential contest makes a critical difference. I'm just going to review the tipping point states in the presidential elections going back in recent elections. So 2020, it was Wisconsin. We were tied by some political scientists' accounts with Pennsylvania. 2016 was also Wisconsin. 2012 was Colorado. 2008 was Iowa, tied with Colorado. 2004 was Ohio. 2000, Florida. Wisconsin was the second closest state that year, I'll note. 1996 was Pennsylvania. 92, Tennessee. 88, Michigan. 84, Michigan. 80, Illinois. 76, Wisconsin. 72, Ohio, tied with Maine, which means that 9 of the 13 tipping point states over the presidential elections in the modern era, going back to 1972, have been upper Midwest states. That is a record unequaled by any other region in the country. And of course, it is necessary to have geographic diversity of the different regions across the US. But in order to make sure we serve our ultimate goal of selecting a nominee who's ready to win the presidency, it's critical to have upper Midwestern states represented. And I think the opportunity presented by my multiple fellow Midwestern state chairs who have submitted their states for consideration offers itself to this committee in the form of an opportunity to ensure that as we go forward in 2024 and beyond, the nomination process best prepares our party to gather the strength that it needs and prepares our nominees to be able to compete and win in the state that will ultimately propel them to the White House. So for all of those reasons, for the reason of reflecting the full diversity of our coalition, of building state party infrastructure in places where it has the massive, massive impact, and to prepare us to win the presidency, I respectfully and with deep gratitude for the thoughtfulness and care in this process, ask this committee to select at least one Midwestern state as one of the first 5 or however many it is, early nominating states in this process. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chair Wickler. Are there any questions? Jenna, do we see any questions?
Yes, we actually have a chat question from Ms. Donna Brazil. She says, good points on the competitive political environment in the Midwest in both presidential and non-presidential years. Can you explain how GOP-controlled legislatures have diluted voting rights, such as same-day registration and more in your region?
Absolutely. So Republican attacks on the foundations of our democracy have been especially fierce in our region precisely because Republicans recognize that if they can shape the electorate going into presidential election years, it's a path to suppressing their way to the White House. Wisconsin, I'm grateful to say, still has same-day voter registration, but it has one of the most restrictive voter ID laws in the country, affecting both in-person voting and, unusually, absentee voting. You have to take a photo of your voter ID in order to upload it to a website in order to request an absentee ballot here. That said, Wisconsin, like Ohio and Iowa, like Ohio, as long as this court situation drags out, has a very gerrymandered state legislative map. But there is progress on the anti-gerrymandering front that, especially in states like Michigan, now potentially over time Ohio, with the court battles happening. Of course, Iowa is already a marquee state in terms of having a nonpartisan redistricting process. It creates an opportunity over time to make progress in state legislative fights. All that said, we know that the same laws that affect that affect primaries are going to affect the elections in the fall. And so figuring out how to organize our way around GOP voter suppression is critical. And the more time and attention goes into building a cadre of organizers who have the skills to win in primary elections using the election laws that people see in the fall, the better our chance to help voters leap over the hurdles and obstacles placed in their way by Republicans in order to win in November. It's one reason it's so critical for us to build the apparatus in the spring that will be used in the fall. And that makes the importance of having a likely tipping point state as a early primary state even more important.
Are there any more questions in the chat for Ben?
Nope, not seeing any more questions at this time.
Well, thank you so much, Ben, for spending your evening with us. I'll turn this back over to Jim.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chair Wickler. And I'll just comment that my mother's family is from a little town in Wisconsin that maybe even you have never heard of called Independence, but it's near Whitehall and Eau Claire, and La Crosse is the big city. So have a little feel for what you're talking about.
Thank you.
Our next speaker this evening is Burton Warrington. He is the president of Indian Ave Group. Burton's career has included a unique mix of legal, business, management, and policy experience. As president and CEO of Prairie Band, LLC, he developed and managed the economic holding company for the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation. As a counselor to the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs at the U.S. Department of Interior, he was involved in a variety of national issues, including Indian gaming, economic and energy development, fee to trust issues, and natural resource and cultural rights protection. Thank you for being with us tonight, Burton. The floor is yours.
Yeah, appreciate that introduction. Anytime I speak publicly, I always like to start out with a quote by Aristotle, and that quote is, "The mark of an educated mind is the ability to entertain a thought without accepting it." Again, the mark of an educated mind is the ability to entertain a thought without accepting it. And some of the viewpoints I'm going to share with you today, just I hope you all keep an open mind on them, and maybe it helps improve the process and the things that you all are thinking about, and maybe it's a less traditional approach to information. So I wanted to start out first. I'm a citizen of the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation, a federally recognized tribe, but born and raised on the Menominee Indian Reservation. And my father was Menominee, and my mother is Potawatomi and Ho-Chunk. So mixed in with three of the different federally recognized tribes. But just out of the gate, I want to make sure that I don't speak for any of the tribes. I'm not an elected leader, so I'm here in my personal capacity and just sharing some insights. As Jim mentioned, I've been involved in a few different things over the years. And one of the first questions I always have for people is, no, there's only maybe 5 people on camera, but I'm always interested if people know how many federally recognized tribes are in this country. And I usually get blind stares, but there's 574 federally recognized tribes that the United States government has a federal relationship on a sovereign to sovereign nation basis. And because of how things have developed over time, our tribes as sovereign nations are surrounded by states. We're not part of the state, but our borders are surrounded by states, and we get lumped in with the state. So I got citizenship in Wisconsin. I got citizenship in my sovereign nation, and I got U.S. citizenship. So, but as you start thinking about 574 tribes, and you take out Alaska and California, you're down to 237 tribes. And out of those 237 tribes, 15% of those tribal nations exist in the Midwest. So there's 35 tribal nations in what's known as the Midwest Alliance of Sovereign Tribes. So it's 35 federally recognized tribes that have a government-to-government relationship, treaty trust obligations with the federal government. So it's 15% of the tribes not in California or Alaska are in the Midwest. And it's a very, very important issue. When you start talking about political landscapes, I can't do any better than the previous speaker just talked about our state party chair. But I did want to talk a little bit about what that means to us on the ground. So, Wisconsin's, most people on this call know about the gerrymandering happening up here. So you start asking what happens in a tribal community at election time. Well, we exist in the 8th congressional district. We don't have a choice. Our vote does not matter to the 8th congressional race, and it's purposefully done that way. So take that one out of the equation. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to us. There's no incentive for people on the ground to vote in that congressional race because that's been decided for us before we even have an opportunity to vote. And you fast forwarded into early voting. And I should just say this out of the gate is sometimes you get so many smart people in a room, they make something really complicated. And I think that's what's happened with early voting is it makes no sense at all that all of us shouldn't vote on the same day, if at all possible. And I think there's enough smart people to figure this out. I know there's processes in place, but even advocating one region over another region, one state over another state, that's more complicated than I think it needs to be. So going back to gerrymandering, what happens on the ground in Wisconsin? Well, I'm only bringing up Wisconsin because that's the context that I can provide. So on the ground, I was in Wisconsin leading up to the primaries in Wisconsin, and unfortunately, we had one candidate not step foot in the state, and that candidate then asked for our support in November. So I was on the campaign trail with Senator Sanders, and went all across northern Wisconsin. You didn't see one Democrat sign. Everything was Trump. And then guess what happens in November? We lose the state by less than 23,000 votes. Well, some of this results from when we're not asked to participate in the spring, or we don't matter in the spring, but then 8 to 9 months later, we matter. And that feels very much like the same as gerrymandering, that we don't really have a choice over who's our nominee because of where we are in the process. And I imagine there's a lot more people that feel the same way. So, it contributes to excitement on the ground. I've spent a lot of time on the ground trying to get people to vote that don't traditionally vote. And these are the things that people notice. So, that's a problem for us in our tribal community is writ large, we're invisible to a lot of people until somebody needs us. And that's very much how it feels when elections come around. In the tribal communities, there's a lack of investment. Unless there's something in it for somebody why they would come to our community, but people notice that stuff, and the lack of investment does matter to us. So I think that's a natural occurrence when the cycle is the way that it is, and you're later in the cycle. There's just a lack of investment up here, a lack of people on the ground, and the lack of building a momentum and then sustaining that. So I think the other part I wanted to just mention about the Midwest with the tribal communities up here is every square inch of what we're referring to as the Midwest was our territory at one point, and many of us believe it still is. So we have these connections to all places in the Midwest, and that's a factual statement. Nobody can argue against that. But understanding why tribal people have these relationships with something much broader than the reservation I come from is 230,000 acres today. We had 10.5 million acres in Wisconsin, and we didn't forget about that over the 1800s when our treaties got reduced. Our ancestors are still buried there. Our sacred sites are still in the state. So it's a lot more than just our reservations. The states and what we're referring to as the Midwest matter to tribes. So just with saying that, I know other speakers have probably pushed this in the Midwest, but we have 7 of the 8 senators in the Democrat column from Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Michigan, but they're all competitive elections. And I don't know, some of the other speakers probably said this, but 2016, the margin was under 23,000 in the presidential election, under 30,000 in 2018 election, and then 2020 under 21,000. So very competitive elections. And for us in Wisconsin, the tribal estimated vote is around 71,000 votes. So when you're talking 20,000 margins, I can't say definitively that we helped President Biden win in 2020, but I can guarantee if we stayed home, he would not have won Wisconsin. So, all this I think goes back to a larger issue too, is in how do you address these things as early investment in our communities? And a lot of times when I've been involved in the DNC over the years, there's not a lot of information out there, or people don't readily think about it, going back to invisibility. But that's because as a party, we're choosing not to get that information. The information's out there. We're not investing in it, and we're not investing in the communities where we have generally low voter turnout. But it's for a reason. And in a state like Wisconsin, 20,000 votes are going to matter, and that could decide who's in the White House or who has control of the Senate. And in a broader regional impact, Minnesota and Michigan got similar tribal populations to Wisconsin. The one good thing that we have is Iowa's within the Midwest Alliance of Sovereign Tribes. There's one tribe in Iowa, and many of the presidential candidates end up on the reservation there. So our issues do get elevated. When you're talking diversity of issues, if Iowa wasn't early in the process, nobody would go there. I know you all are busy. Don't want to spend too much of your evening, but happy to answer any questions or expand on anything that I had mentioned. But just appreciate your time. Appreciate the willingness for you all to invite a voice like mine into this process.
Thank you very much, Burton. These are very, very important things for us to think about, and I appreciate your raising them. Jenna, do we have any questions in the queue?
We do not have any questions from RBC members at this time.
Okay, well, thank you, Burton, and we will be referencing what you've had to say and paying close attention to it. So thank you very much.
All right. Appreciate it. Hope you all enjoy your evening.
Thank you, Burton.
Mignon, back to you.
Sure, thank you. Our next speaker this evening is Paul Maslin. Paul has been one of the leading public opinion analysts and campaign strategists for more than 3 decades. His work includes polling and providing strategy for Doug Jones, our latest Sherpa for our Supreme Court nominee, Kristen Sinema, and the ongoing Quality of Life Index for UCLA's Luskin School of Public Policy. Thank you for being with us this evening, Paul. And if you're on, I'll let you have the floor.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. And I will add to that list of, we are also have been working and are still working in Wisconsin for Majority PAC, Tammy Baldwin's original election, her re-election, and we are involved this year in the election to defeat Ron Johnson in Wisconsin. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of the peculiarities of the Midwest, some of the reasons why it matters, some of the things that we've learned about politics here in this part of the country. I'm going to start with a simple observation. In my lifetime, we had a set of presidential nominees for Massachusetts. We had a set of presidential nominees, including the first person I ever worked for, Jimmy Carter, who are from the South. But everybody else has been either from Illinois or born in Illinois or from Minnesota. And then there's Joe Biden. And even though Scranton is technically more east than anything else, I think we all could agree that Pennsylvania in many ways is now certainly an industrial state. It's one of the 3 states that everybody focused on in the last couple of elections. And in many ways, certainly west of the Appalachians is more of a Midwestern state than it is a Northeastern state. And I'm one who grew up in the Philadelphia area. So I'm well aware that Philadelphians would object to that. But so there has been in I think more of a footprint of the Midwest in our party's politics than sometimes people acknowledge. It's been very important. I think it's fair to say, and I'm not getting into the particulars now of what's happened in terms of Iowa and its status, but there's no question in my mind that in 2008, when the world looked a lot different to a lot of us then than it does today, there's no question that the connection that Barack Obama had in the Midwest was one of the big reasons why he won the nomination. He won Iowa originally. He won Wisconsin both times. I mean, everybody here, we don't like the Vikings or the Bears, but we had no problem voting in huge numbers in both of those elections, both the primary election where Obama won a decisive victory, and then obviously in the fall when he won by 14 percentage points, which is a margin that almost seems unbelievable today when we realize that our last three elections for governor and president have been decided by essentially 1 percentage point or less. The last two we won, the first one obviously we lost in 2016. So there has been a connection, I think, that is still there and still present, even as everyone understands and everyone on this call understands there are at least three distinct parts of the country that are mattering more than anything else. The Midwest happens to be one of them, and obviously the Atlantic coast going down to Georgia and Florida, and then clearly the West, the Rocky Mountain and the southwestern states. You know, all three of those sort of nexi, if that's a word, of our politics have become very, very important. Well, this is one of them. And what I'll say about the Midwest are two basic things. One is, and this directly relates to the primary system, we essentially have a bunch of states where there is no party registration. They're just voters. What that means is we have open primaries generally. We have a tradition of people, and I'm not one who ever believes that most voters are strategic. Well, I'm going to vote in that party because I don't want that person, and I'm going to somehow jimmy up the whole process. That rarely happens. But we do have, depending on the election, depending on the waves, depending on the particular focus, we do have a situation where, it is not as so simple to identify as these are absolutely going to be the voters and these people will never vote and these people aren't allowed to vote and these people are somewhere different. We have a much more fluid situation, and it has led to, and it's some very interesting results through the years, sometimes surprising, sometimes not. But it certainly means that in many ways, more voters are in play at an earlier time in the Midwest in any given cycle than no matter when the actual timing of our elections are. And obviously, even beyond Iowa, we've had many of our states, even when the calendar was different. We've had Ohio become a crucial state in various primary campaigns. We've had Michigan become more important recently. Wisconsin has had dramatic roles in 2 or 3 different elections. Illinois is the same thing. So there's a history here of no matter when how the arrow spins and when the timing works of states that are important. The second big thing I want to say, and I think it's very germane to all of the politics and the thinking today and the way we're trying to react here in 2022 and thinking beyond. We have unbelievably competitive states where the stakes of winning for Senate, winning for governor, winning for other statewide offices, winning a legislature. Again, as the previous speaker mentioned, of course, the Democratic Party's been gerrymandered out of business in Wisconsin because of Scott Walker and the legislature that he brought with him in 2010. And we're still dealing with all the after effects of that. Other states have different laws, and the Supreme Courts are now getting involved. And so, that'll be an ongoing process. But I think the bottom line is it is extraordinarily competitive across state after state after state. There's a couple of them that have moved a little bit more in the other direction, but who knows what might happen or whether they'll snap back. The tides ebb and flow. One of the reasons it is so competitive is that I think that, and every, we do politics, so I can't tell you how many people in a given state say to me, our state is a microcosm of America. And usually there's some truth in what they say. There are very few states, California happens to be one of them, where people just simply say, we're different, and we know it. Most people say, well, we are the example of what America is. Well, in the Midwest, it's a pretty good case. And what I would simply say is that almost every, again, I'm taking myself out of the former, Iowa, New Hampshire question. But every one of the crucial states, and we know that there are at least 3 of them, obviously, that matter unbelievably in terms of every level of election, with counting Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. But even as you go into Minnesota or Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, we have major metropolitan areas with big city and urban populations that are extremely important to varying degrees in terms of electoral share, but they are important in the psyche and the history and the sort of fundamental perception of each of these major states and even the more medium-sized states in the Midwest. Those metropolitan areas also have significant suburban areas. One of the things I talk about in Wisconsin, and I keep hoping for the day that this will not be something I can say, is that when I've lived in several different suburban areas of different metropolitan areas, media markets in the country, Milwaukee happens to be almost the only one. Some people argue maybe Cincinnati might be the same, but Milwaukee is almost the only one that I'm aware of, certainly in the northeast quadrant of our country, where there has not been significant movement from R to D over the last 20 or 25 years in the suburbs for a variety of reasons. And I won't go into it in this call, but those suburbs have remained resistant and are still voting heavily Republican, even as suburbs in Chicago and Detroit and Philadelphia and a whole bunch of other places have moved, as we all know, moved very, very much differently. But it all still underscores the importance, because if the Milwaukee suburbs acted like most of these other suburbs, Wisconsin wouldn't even be a close state anymore. I mean, we would have significant advantages as a party. But so you have that part. And then we obviously also have a very substantial working class, more non-college educated, rural / small town / small city, blue collar element from Western Pennsylvania to Northern Michigan, the Upper Peninsula, various parts of Ohio, Northern and Northwestern Wisconsin, the same Northern and Western Minnesota, et cetera, downstate Illinois, in which there are various trends that some places have been more Democratic in the past than not. Other places have been more consistently Republican. Obviously, they're more under threat now for the reasons we all know about and the way our politics have shifted in the last 2 or 3 cycles. But it doesn't mean that they aren't still very important, and that all 3 of these pieces, the urban, the suburban, the major metro, and then the small city or small town rural, don't in fact matter. I'm never one of those who says, well, we have to choose. It has to be this, has to be that. Forget those voters. We don't have that luxury. This country is too close. It is too competitive. The things are way too critical in these tight states for us to turn our back on any one of those constituencies, or to somehow think that one of them is the silver bullet and the others aren't. I don't think it's ever been that simplistic. And so I think in the Midwest, you really get that mix of issues that makes sense. Some people will want to talk trade, and other people will talk healthcare. And some people the Republicans obviously will bring in immigration, and even though it's not as much significant an issue or as pressing or interesting an issue, since our border is largely Canada, as opposed to what you have in other parts of the country, but it's still there as a voting issue. And then on to crime and violence and guns. I'm in a state in Wisconsin where we've had far too many incidents like the one we just saw in Texas, and other parts that have divided the population, and these are important issues, and then of course issues like choice and gay rights and a variety of other things that come into play. They're all there in the Midwest. It's not, we haven't turned our back or moved beyond or created some kind of politics 2.0 or some kind of new Democratic coalition, which I know we all would love to believe exists, and isn't it true and isn't it wonderful? And here we are in a very tight, tough, competitive, national dynamic where we barely have a majority, where we're facing a tough midterm election, where our prospects are uncertain in 2024 and beyond, and we have to fight. So I'll simply close by saying that the Midwest is a nice microcosm. It is a crucial state. If any of the states go early, I think that's a good thing for the party. I think it's a place where we ought to have open competition. A lot of our nominees And you look ahead, whatever happens in 2024, but look ahead beyond 2024, it's entirely likely in the rest of my lifetime that we're going to have more nominees from the Midwest, because it seems to be, an interesting training and proving ground for a lot of our politics. And I think it's a cliche, but there is something grounded about the center of the country. It's not either coast. It's not the fancy parts of the world. There's Kathy Kramer, a political scientist, did a very important, and as it turned out, prescient analysis of a lot of what was happening in Wisconsin as Walker took office 10 or 12 years ago, and why some of the significant shift was starting to take place in what I'll call outstate Wisconsin. And it obviously bloomed, flourished, if that you can use those words, got even worse for us, obviously, under Trump and beyond. And some of the Herb Kohl and Russ Feingold and other people used to win in Northwest Wisconsin. Dave Obey used to be his district, used to be the old, sort of farm labor kind of vote that you saw in Minnesota. And obviously a lot of that has disappeared. And what she found back then, and it's still true, is there are a lot of people in the Midwest who think, for whatever reason, whether legitimately or not, that essentially each party, but definitely our party, has sort of passed them by. It sort of looks down on them, ignores them, thinks they're not worthy, or they're stupid, or they're racist, or they're this. And, and there's been a counter reaction to that. Doesn't mean they're always right. Doesn't mean we have to pander to them, but it is something we have to acknowledge. And those voters are going to matter, just as the suburban voters and the millennials are going to matter, just as the African Americans and Latinos are going to matter, and the other voters that make up our coalition. It's all there in the Midwest, and I'll stop there.
Well, Paul, you have certainly shown that you have been at this for some time, and your depth and your knowledge has been very refreshing. And thank you for all the insight, or reminding us of all the things we should know. With that, I think we might have a question in the chat from Ms. Brazil.
Yes, we do. This is a question from Donna Brazil. Election deniers, or those who believe there were massive fraud in 2020, are winning in some places, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and perhaps losing in others. Do you believe the MAGA movement is growing? And if so, what states or where in the Midwest?
I think it's evolving. I don't know if growing is the right word, Donna. I think that it's evolving, and in some places it's getting stronger, and in other places it's getting weaker. And I think the real test is going to start coming in November. There is a terrific counter message that we may be able to employ in some of these crucial states, in places, for example, like the Milwaukee suburbs, or other parts of those states where we may be able to knock them back a peg or two, and to the point that you would say where they're not growing anymore. On the other hand, it is certainly true that we may not have bottomed out yet in the parts of Western Pennsylvania or parts of Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, where they have made gains. It's entirely possible those gains could continue. And in a lower turnout, different kind of dynamic midterm election, it's possible that they could make further gains there. So I don't think there's a simple, easy answer to say MAGA is growing or MAGA is weakening. I think both are occurring. I think Trump is still an extremely, even not on the ballot, he still casts a huge shadow. Obviously, everyone's analyzing these primaries and whether his candidates are winning or losing or whatever. And obviously, there's some still up for grabs that Pennsylvania may be fought over for a while yet. But I think the jury is still out as to whether, we know he's essentially taken over most of the Republican Party, whether that's good or bad for them in 2022, whether it mitigates against what is lining up to be a good political year for them, but makes it more difficult. And whether, let's remember, we held the Senate in 2010 largely because they put some Looney Tunes on the ballot. And I am very eager to see what ultimately will shake out now in terms of, let's take the Senate as an example, but we know these governor's races are unbelievably important too. What shakes out in terms of what they're actually offering, and how do voters in the middle react to, for lack of a better word, the MAGA approach. So My easy answer to you is to say both things are probably happening at once. They're probably still growing organically and internally within the Republican Party and in some of their better areas, but I think they may take a hit in other parts of the region and when we get to a November election.
Thank you, Paul. Any more questions for Paul?
I see no other questions at this time.
Thank you again, Paul. Thank you
Quite
so
welcome.
much. And I'll turn this back over to Jim.
Thanks, Paul. I always learn something when I listen to you, so appreciate it.
Thank you.
Our final speaker this evening is Aaron Pickrell. Aaron is a political consultant at Remington Road Group in Columbus, Ohio. In Ohio, he advised the campaigns of former Governor Ted Strickland and President Barack Obama. In 2012, Aaron served as an Ohio senior advisor for Obama for America. Pickrell is one of Politico's 50 Politicos to watch. The floor is yours, Aaron.
Hi, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. It's kind of intimidating following somebody like Paul who knows a lot more than a lot of us. But I echo a lot of the things that he was saying and the importance of the industrial Midwest when it comes to, especially in the pre-calendar phase, when you can sort of set the tone of how the presidential election is going to go. The industrial Midwest is going to make or break the path to 270. And the industrial Midwest is going to make or break our ability to have, 50 plus US senators. So I think that having a state from this part of the world that is right there in the early pre-calendar phase is really could really be important and valuable, not only in helping to choose the nominee, but also to win the general election. I have the sort of privilege of growing up in Iowa and cutting my teeth in Iowa politics and worked in the Iowa caucuses in 2003 and 2004. I've been in Ohio working in campaigns and politics for the last 15 or 16 years. So I've kind of been able to see the gamut of organizing. And I do think one of the really important things that the Midwest brings that I know other regions of the state can, but it's the value and the efficacy of the retail politics that comes to bear. And I was just sort of looking through the criteria that you all are looking at as you're going to make your decisions on who comes in pre-calendar, and with diversity, competitiveness, and feasibility all kind of tied in. That kind of helped me think through the pieces of it. But I think the feasibility of campaigning, like Paul said too, where you have in these Midwest states that have varying urban centers. So you don't have, like some states do, but most states don't have one large city that's going to be 80% of the electorate spread around. You're going to have different media market centers that also force you to go into the rural areas and the suburban areas and campaign. When President Obama ran here in 2008, we kind of ran a retail campaign. He spent an enormous amount of time traveling around and connecting with voters in small communities, almost like not quite Iowa caucus-ish, but darn close. And I think doing that in the industrial Midwest and whatever states may become pre-calendar for y'all could just be a really valuable lesson. I think that one of the other elements that majority of the states in the industrial Midwest bring too is the diversity criteria that you all are looking at. I think that, it's the racial and ethnic diversity, cities like Detroit and Milwaukee and Cleveland, the urban versus rural diversity of being able to ensure that you're talking about issues that are important to the majority of the cities across the country, but also you have the ability to connect and motivate rural voters and suburban voters to come into our column. You have the union diversity. The industrial Midwest has great union density and great union leadership. And you have public employee unions, you have the industrial unions, you have the building trades. So you have diversity within the union movement as well that I think is really valuable and important. And then the economic diversity that comes to bear of, very affluent suburbs and college towns and things like that. And then really struggling areas in Appalachia and other parts of these states. So I think that just being able to cover the gamut of voters that we need to appeal to and constituents that are really important, the industrial Midwest can really check a lot of those boxes. Then I think at competitiveness, Paul really laid it out, but I think the industrial Midwest is where the path to 270 has to go through. There's just not, it hasn't changed. The country hasn't evolved enough yet to get you there without your Pennsylvanias and Michigans and Wisconsins and Ohio. Ohio's going to be back on the top of the list one of these years. Recognize it's hard now, but we're getting there. And then the feasibility of campaigning in these states. I think you do have the ability to, travel in an efficient way. So you're not having to fly from one part of a state to another in order to cover a lot of voters. You can spend a day campaigning in Michigan or Wisconsin and be in front of a lot of voters in an urban area and a suburban area and a rural area and still have a compact use of time, which I think, valuable from that sort of pre-calendar phase. And then the other part that I do think that why it would be really valuable to have industrial Midwest state pre-calendar is the ability to the world always fall on these early states when it comes to the nominating process and how the parties are branded. And I think that the issue set right now in the industrial Midwest of, President Biden's focus on the resurgence of manufacturing, bringing back good union jobs, onshoring. I think it's something broadband to underserved areas. These issues that really resonate. We don't necessarily have those issues break through to some of the voters we need to in these states. And I think this would be a way to really beat that drum. It's still stuck in my head from President Obama's reelection in 2012, when we talked about how he saved the auto industry and 80 of Ohio's 88 counties have supply chain jobs. It's one of those issues that you just continue to talk about, and it helped frame Democrats in Ohio in a positive way that, it's hard, but because we were able to spend so much time and effort focusing on how Democrats are fighting for manufacturing, fighting for good paying jobs, it really helped. And I think that having one of the pre-calendar states be from the industrial Midwest would really help ensure that message is getting driven on a national level. So there you go. There's my pitch.
Are there questions for Aaron?
I do not see any questions from RBC members.
Thank you, Aaron, for your input, and we appreciate your time this evening.
No, you bet. You got to be quick when you're last.
That's right. Good rule of thumb. Okay.
Thank you.
Let me turn it back to you then, Mignon.
Sure, thanks. And thanks, Aaron. So members, that concludes our agenda for today's listening session. But before we go, are there any questions? And if you have any, please raise your hand in the raise the hand feature. Seeing no further questions, I want to thank you again. And we also want to thank the staff and the production team, as well as our court reporter and the sign language interpreters who appeared on all the live stream broadcasts. Thank you for participating in this process, and we're looking forward to working with you over the upcoming months. Thanks again, and have a good evening.
Great to see you all.
Bye-bye.